are listening to This is Oklahoma, hosted by Mike Hearn, telling stories of Oklahomans and those that have made it their home.
This podcast is presented by the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, telling Oklahoma's story through its people since 1927. For more information on the Hall of Fame, go to www.oklahomahof.com and follow them on Instagram for daily updates at oklahomahof. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of This is Oklahoma. Mike Hearn here, host, back with another episode down in Norman area, roughly. North Norman, Southmore, about that area, down at the home of Simple Modern with Mike Beckham. I guess to talk about, everyone listening was going to see this name and think, we know that brand. We probably have a cup. I now have a cup thanks to your awesome assistant, which I'm definitely going to use every day, and I'm going to put a sticker on it soon. But, you know, this brand, as a lot of people know, and as we've been chatting, you said that there's been a lot of media attention recently, and you've had some tweets go viral and office decorations, some fun stuff. But we're going to dive into, I guess, the real kind of background story, because when you look at the website, you've got a great about video, and it tells you the mission and everything. But a lot of people don't get to hear, like, you and your passion story and kind of how it all comes around. So I really appreciate you, taking the time out, coming on the podcast today to share that story. But I guess first of all, I mean, what's kind of current state of the union at the moment?
Yeah, so it's a very full and exciting year. Mm-hmm. One of the best parts about leading a business is that you put in all this work and you kind of set up things months or years in the future, especially when you're dealing with consumer packaged goods and like having to buy inventory. And so we've got this period that's going to happen over the next few months where 5 or 6 major things. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a game of poker where you're flipping over cards in the middle of the table and you're really excited to see what's on those cards, and that's going to happen for us. So we're going to take on domestic manufacturing this year. We're going to go live in Walmart nationwide. Our Target business is going to grow by like 50 or 60%. We've got like 4 or 5 major new products we're releasing. We've got big licensees like Marvel that we're going live with. There's just a ton of exciting stuff happening, and so a little bit overwhelming, a little bit overstimulating, but also pretty exciting. The last few years, we've grown by about 1.5 million units of sales every year. Mm-hmm. And last year, I think we sold maybe 6.5 million units as a company. This year, we think it's probably going to be closer to 10.5 or 11. And so we're going to grow a lot more in this year than we ever have before. Which is like intimidating, obviously, but it's also like it's exciting, like to just see how many customers we're getting to serve, and really, like you said, just it's crazy. But when you start something, when you're an entrepreneur and you start something in the early days, you're just trying to figure out, how do I get anybody to care about this at all? Yeah. Like, I'm introducing like the idea of our company to people, and they're like, "So are you just like a Yeti knockoff, or like what are you?" And in fact, a funny story I tell, the entrepreneur in residence up at the University of Oklahoma, and they had me in 2016 when I was just getting started with the company. They had me come and teach at one of the classes, and this is before anybody, especially a student, would have known about Simple Modern. And so they had this segment at the beginning of the class that they did before I taught, which was like the professor gave them a company and said, "Hey, this is a case study. Evaluate this company, their chances in the market, whatever else." And so this group gets up before I teach, and they had been given Simple Modern. They didn't know that was my company, and they proceeded for 10 minutes to just dunk on Simple Modern and how like we had no chance, like we were doomed, and Yeti was going to chew us up and spit us out, and Hydro Flask. And so anyway, I just didn't even react, give the entire lecture, and then at the very end, I kind of revealed like, "Hey, by the way, that company is actually my company, and there's actually a couple details you didn't know, and things it might change your mind." And so the students are like, "Okay, wait, we want to change our mind." I'm like, "No, you're dead to me." But it's funny, you spend all this time trying to make people care about, and it feels like it takes 1,000 pounds of force to move things an inch. Yeah. And then you get to the place where we're at, where we have tens of millions of customers, and every day I see something where I'm like, I just wouldn't have even thought that was possible. Like something that just happened last month, and my co-founder and I were joking about it. Klay Thompson, came back after like a couple years of not playing basketball, and there was all this media around it. And I guess he just decided to buy a Simple Modern Tennessee Titans water bottle, and that's what he had on the bench. So there's all this video and pictures of him holding it and smiling and all this stuff, and you're just like, okay, that's pretty crazy. We had nothing to do with that. That's just totally organic. And we have this on our internal Slack channel. We have a channel called In the Wild, which is just like when you randomly see the product out and about. And like in the first few months, it was just like, it was a big deal if you posted anything.
Right.
And now it's like every day you see things, and sometimes like these really crazy things, like, oh, this really, famous person or whatever had this. And so anyway, the State of the Union I think is good, but it's also exciting because really the company's built on this idea of how can you build a company around generosity where you're focused not just on the shareholders and how do the shareholders get more, but how's everybody's life enriched by it. So that's the employees, that's the customers that you serve, that's the community that you're a part of. And one of our big things is that we give at least 10% of profits annually. Most of that goes to local, nonprofit organizations. So this year we're going to be able to do more there than we ever had before. We've got like a giving summit that we'll do next week, actually, and we're going to have like 20 organizations come in and present, and then we'll be able to kind of allocate giving. And so as much as I get excited about selling more things and having more customers, I get even more excited about the fact that like, hey, hopefully we're able to make a positive impact on the community that we're a part of, which is obviously Oklahoma. I've been in Oklahoma basically my entire life. And so us being a part of improving the community is a big deal to me.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, perfect segue. Thanks for saying you've been a part of Oklahoma your entire life, because that's an easy way to lead into it. Tell me about growing up and kind of like what you're into and family and brothers and sisters and kind of were you a sports guy and stuff like that?
For sure. So, grew up in North Oklahoma City, went to PC North High School, and even though I've traveled a lot, I've basically lived in the metro area my entire life. I ended up going to OU, and then I've never left Norman. So growing up, I played sports. I did debate in high school, did student council, that kind of stuff. Had a younger brother named Matt who has turned into like a pretty amazing entrepreneur in his own right. He actually started a company before I ever did. And I think a lot of my, I think to be an entrepreneur, you have to have somebody who goes before you and kind of speaks affirmation and confidence into your life. I don't know if that's been your experience with the podcast, but I mean, starting things is hard, right? And it's just so easy to make a list of all the reasons why it can't work or it won't work. And so for me, that's definitely one of the things that my brother helped do for me, even though he's younger, is he helped, he kind of went first in the entrepreneurial realm. And I worked with him for several years before myself and a couple of friends started Simple Modern. But yeah, I think growing up, I think I was a pretty normal kid, I was obsessed with Michael Jordan and the Bulls, and, I don't think I ever dreamed that I was going to be an entrepreneur. Like, I don't think I wasn't that kid that was like running a lemonade stand at 6 or something. But I think being a part of Oklahoma, for sure, now that I'm in my 40s, I can really appreciate how much the culture and the values that I was surrounded by growing up have made really an indelible impact in the way that I see the world, the way that I think about business and running a company. And so for sure got Oklahoma fingerprints all over all over me.
So growing up then, a huge fan of the Bulls, but also in debate, right? So there was like part of you that's like, I want to be an athlete, I love sports, but then part of you that was like critical thinking and kind of had it's not very common, right? Most kids do one or the other.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. And I think growing up, I remember when I was, maybe it was in grade school, I had this pretty expansive vocabulary. And I remember a moment where I realized, like, hey, when I use certain words, the other kids kind of look at me funny, and I need to not do that. I need to like talk like everybody else talks. And I remember feeling self-conscious about that. I think that that's probably my earliest memory of realizing like that I had this desire to kind of fit in and feeling like I felt a little bit different. And then, maybe everybody experiences that. And then as you get older, you feel more comfortable in your own skin. But Certainly, like, there's this weird kind of dynamic between, you know, academics and like sports and then kind of leadership, and you kind of pick, you know, and I kind of have done a little bit of all those different ones. But fortunately, the academics, the big way that paid off is I got a full ride to OU. There's something called a Regent Scholarship that's really specific to Oklahoma. If you get above a certain ACT or SAT score, you get a full ride for 5 years, which was awesome. So I took all 5 years of that. But that's part of the story how I ended up.
So you mentioned your brother was quite entrepreneurial. Were your parents entrepreneurial as well?
No. So my parents are both in the mental health profession. So like the joke that I'll tell people is that the only difference between me and other people is I know the names for all my disorders. But, you know, here's what came from my mom. You know, my mom worked with kids that had been emotionally, sexually, physically abused. My father is a psychologist. And when I would talk to my parents about why they chose to be in the fields that they did, you know, I think we take things from our parents, these kind of core things that, you know, taking from your parents. And my parents had 2 or 3, but one of them was, they said, you know, we did not pick the profession where we could make the most money. We picked this profession because we felt like we could help the most people. And so I think that was kind of a foundational thing growing up that, you know, a lot of people don't hear their parents say something like that. That really stuck in my head. I don't know if you're in the Enneagram, but I'm like an Enneagram 3, which is basically like this achiever mentality. But one of the things that's interesting is like the way that you define success really matters. If you're like, I want to be successful, I want to achieve. Okay, what is success? What is achieving? And I think that my parents helped frame that as, you know, success and achievement is when you really help others succeed. You help others do better and thrive. And so thankful for that about my parents. But certainly there was no like obvious reason why my brother and I would turn into entrepreneurs.
Super interesting though, isn't it? Very interesting.
I mean, actually, like my first job out of college was in the nonprofit world. I basically was on staff with a ministry. I worked with college students, mentoring college students, and I thought I'd do 1 year, and 1 year turned into 2, turned into 10. But it makes a lot of sense, you know, like with the background, like it makes sense that I would be drawn to something like that. Maybe the part of my career arc that makes less sense is how I ended up being an entrepreneur. So you go through, I mean, you get a full ride to OU. What are you thinking when you're going to OU? Are you thinking, like, do you have kind of like a plan of, I'm going to go do this, this is kind of the job that I want to go for, and these are the classes I'm going to take, or does it just kind of figure it out as I go along? So I got to OU. I think my first major was something like political science. It's funny, you know, you show up at college and immediately everybody's asking you your major, and no college freshman has any idea what they're doing. You know, it's just like you're just trying to find something to say where it sounds like you know, you have the plan. But I think I really came to college. I mentioned earlier, like my personality can be kind of, I can frame things around achievement or accomplishment. And I think I really came up to college thinking like the thing that gives me value or makes me important or makes me lovable or whatever is when I achieve. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get this GPA. I'm going to win these awards. And, you know, I'd say for probably about 2 years, chased that, and at least on paper was really successful in doing that. But there was this kind of reckoning that this wall I kind of ran into at one point where I realized that my life certainly looked better on paper than it felt to experience it. And that I felt really hollow, that these things that I thought like achieving these things or winning these awards or whatever was going to do, it was not accomplishing that. And so that's definitely part of my story is I was in college for 5 years, and I had this like kind of fairly major spiritual kind of life moment that happens midway through college. But that's really what prompted it is I kind of got to the end of like, hey, on paper at least, I've kind of been successful. And yet this feels pretty empty. And it turns into this kind of major life definition moment. So if you could kind of cut my college career into 2 halves, and they look pretty different, certainly my worldview really changed. And I think the combination of the family that I grew up in and that experience helps to explain a lot of how we think about the company and just why some of the things that we do, and even the ways that I think about things are fairly atypical.
Yeah. I guess you probably get, I mean, like I said, you kind of busted your ass for 2 years or whatever, got the grades you wanted, and it looks like, on paper, it looks like you're super successful, but then you look at like the impact and like the meaning of the stuff that you've done. And then, like I said, you kind of find it doesn't to anyone else doesn't mean anything else. And I haven't, I haven't like changed anybody's life, even though I've got, really good grades. Yeah. And then you have that moment. And where do you go from there? Do you change your major and decide to go into something else?
Yeah, I mean, the way it worked out was it was about that time that I found finance, and I'd always done pretty well in school, but finance just like intuitively made sense. It just clicked at a level that I don't think anything had before. Which when you're having kind of a worldview change moment, it's not like, oh, okay, I'm going to go into the altruistic world of finance. Like that doesn't necessarily fit.
Right.
So that was kind of happening. I met my wife of 19 years, Heather, during that period. That was a major life event. But I think for the first time I started to really play out my life and say, what do I really want to use the time that I have, however much I have, towards? What are meaningful things? Some of the things that I think happened is I just started to understand the central value of relationships, why relationships were really kind of the core of what it is to live well, whatever you do. But I did start to think a lot about kind of career and what was calling. So when I got close to graduation, I kind of had these different paths. One was like, maybe I go get a PhD and I teach finance. One was, I'm going to go into the business world and try and be very generous, because I feel like I've got gifting here, but I'd love to be able to give generously. But I was also engaged. My wife had one more year. She was doing a bachelor's and master's in accounting at the same time. And so this opportunity to do like this kind of 1 year kind of mentoring ministry kind of role came up. And I thought, well, this works great. My wife's going to still be in college. It's an opportunity for me to do this for a year. And, that first year I raised my salary. So like I had to go out and personally fundraise. It was $18,000. Yeah. And I struggled, to raise $18,000. We lived in this place in Norman. It was literally like the only distinction it had was it was the cheapest place you could rent in Norman. Even then, my father-in-law helped me pay for the rent. And yet, I just feel like that period and that year was so foundational for me, partially because one of the things I think it cemented for my wife and I was how unimportant financial resources and physical possessions were to us and it's like different people have different perspectives, but for us we just realized like, hey, this is not central to living well for us. So one of the parts that's been kind of interesting of our story is like we're now in a pretty different context in terms of like resources that we're trying to steward and stuff like that. But I think there was this kind of, sometimes I'll give the analogy like with dogs, they have this imprinting period when they're young, and whatever happens during that imprinting period, like matters for the rest of its life. So it has a bad experience with lightning during that period, like it's always going to be afraid of lightning. Yeah. And I think for me, that period that started with kind of the middle of college, kind of worldview change and kind of transitioned into early marriage and not having a lot of resources, but doing something I felt like was meaningful and where I was really investing my life in other people, that became kind of this foundational imprinting for my marriage, and also just kind of like for like how I wanted to spend my time. And so anyway,
So that 1 year turns into 10.
Yeah, exactly.
In ministry.
And I think that, it's funny, when I got to 30, if you had talked to people around me when I was 21, like they would have, and you'd said, hey, at 42, this is what Mike's life is going to look like. And you just, you showed them all this. I actually think most of them would have been like, okay, that checks out.
Right.
That
because you were so driven with like,
he's driven and like this kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But if you'd shown them my life at 30, it would not have made sense to them. And, so I got to 30 and it's like, well, listen, no business is beating down my door to come and hire me. And the teaching thing, I guess that's not going to happen, but I felt comfortable in my own skin, like I felt like,
Your life had meaning and value.
Yeah, and you know, like I am such a selfish person. We all are, right?
I am as well.
But it's like
Yeah.
I am selfish, and I think one of the things that I enjoyed the most about the nonprofit world is that I don't know that I've ever really had a selfless motive, but in as much as I can get closer to that, I think there were points and stretches in the nonprofit world where I felt like whatever the best version of myself was in that area, that I was kind of experiencing it. And so when I got to 30, it was like, well, none of that stuff's going to happen. My life has a different path than maybe the one that I had planned, but that's okay, like because I feel like this is meaningful. And then ironically, I mean, like almost, exactly during that period is when my brother approached me and said, hey, I've got this idea for a startup. And I helped him recruit a few other guys, and we started this company. And basically when we started it, I was like, this will be a side project. I'm still leading in this nonprofit ministry role. And that's actually growing really fast. So that's taking up a ton of capacity. But then I helped him start this company, Quibbits, which is like an auction website. This is like October 2009. By November of 2010, that company had its first $1 million revenue day. So, like you've seen movies like The Social Network or something where it's like, just a bunch of kids that don't even have a clue what's going on. I mean, like I was the oldest person associated with the company. I don't even know if I was 31. And, there's Nerf guns all over the office. Like we've got all these people crammed into a space that's way too small. And we were just too naive and young to even understand how crazy it was, what was happening. And so I'm basically working this full-time nonprofit job. I'm working on this startup that has just gone crazy. That's turned into a full-time job. And then my wife and I find out we're pregnant with our first, my son Carter. And it was like, man, I'm riding like multiple horses, at the same time. I don't think I can be excellent at anything if I'm trying to do everything. And that was kind of a major, I think, kind of fork in the road in Heather and I's relationship, but really just in the story of my life, where it was, okay, what is meaning and purpose?
Right.
What is using your 30s well? What does that look like for a career? And the answer that we came to, and we didn't come to it easily, and we had to reevaluate that several times. But ultimately, I feel confident in was that we felt like I could make more positive impact through the business world than I could in the particular kind of nonprofit context I was in. And so around then, like I think I might have been 31, maybe I was 32 when I moved into the business world full time, and I've been there for the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. Does that kind of switch, and when you think I'm going to make more impact in the business world, does that switch happen because you see the money coming in and think, okay, like as much as like me handing out coffee or whatever it is at church, I mean, and giving a helping hand at any event, when you see zeros coming in, you're like, I can do more impact with this and be there as well. Does that help? Because a lot of people they struggle with that, right? Especially in kind of like in like the kind of faith world. A lot of nonprofits or churches or whatever. I mean, money makes the world go round.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple of things. I mean, I think one thing is I'm really big on this idea of asymmetric opportunities, and really has to do with like scale and leverage. Like, what are the things that you can do where you have the potential for impact, the potential for positive is disproportional to what you put into it. And was definitely seeing that in the business world. Like, it was really shocking, like the scale that some of the things we'd built were growing to. And so I saw that. And I do think, I had been raising my salary. So like, me being able to do what I had been doing had depended upon people who were willing to financially give up until that point. And so then, you kind of viscerally understand like, hey, if I can give, like that really makes it possible for other people to do significant things. Although it's interesting, as I've been on this side of the table for a while, I think when I first got into the business world, I really felt like, hey, the number one impact I'm going to be able to make is I'm going to be able to give significantly. I think as I've been here longer, I actually think that's the minority of my impact. I think ultimately what makes, like, I'll give an example. One of our partners, Water 4, fantastic.
Matt, right?
Matt's fantastic.
He's
right?
an incredible human being.
But what makes Water 4 fantastic is that Matt has vision and is driven to do something, something special there. Yeah. And he would be doing it if he had $50 or $50 million.
Yeah.
Like, there is no way that finances would cause Matt to stop doing what he's doing. And
I mean, he tried to kill him and he still does it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that dude's like a Terminator.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I've really learned is that, like, resources usually aren't the blocker for, good things to happen. They can be an accelerant, and that's something that's really fun. When you see somebody who's doing great work, again, like Water 4, and you're like, hey, what you're doing in one district, what if we helped give the resources so you could do it at 2 or 3? But I think that regardless of where we're called, whether it's, the business world or the for-profit world, the nonprofit world, teaching, whatever it is, that the ability to influence and teach and impact other people is always the biggest way that we can make an impact. And so for me in the current kind of dispensation, what that looks like is I'm trying to run a company in a way that's different. Yeah. It's countercultural, right? Like, this thing is getting to scale and it's becoming more profitable. And this is typically the point where, people, I think the stereotype is you get to this point, it's like, how do I cash out? How long till I get my yacht or my private island or whatever?
Yeah. Pina coladas on the beach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, if I wanted to, I could probably go sit on a beach in Maui and just, and I love Maui, so that's an appealing thought. But it's like, I don't think that's the call.
Right.
And I don't think that's the kind of way that I want to use the time that I have. And so what would it look like to be, to lead a company that hopefully its mission and the way that it carries itself and the way that it uses its resources, that it's different. Yeah. It's countercultural in a good way. At this point, I think that might be the opportunity that I have to make the most impact, and where I would hope, like, I have this kind of aversion to social media. I think social media is like the way that you viscerally feel about it really ties to whether or not you grew up with it or not. And I didn't. Like, Facebook, I didn't have a Facebook account until I'm like 22 or 24. But I've taught myself to use social media simply because there's this ability to kind of put out there, hey, here's how we approach things, here's how we do things, here's our mission, here's our mindset. And I've been really, one of the things that's been really fun is connecting with all these other people that are running businesses or want to learn about entrepreneurship or whatever, that are encouraged and challenged by the way that we're doing things. It's also like I'm the entrepreneur in residence at OU. Ironically, the teaching thing came all the way back around. Yeah. There's a back door, right? You don't have to get a PhD. The back door is you just have to be successful enough that they think this schmuck knows something. And so I'm the entrepreneur in residence at OU, but it's a big part of why I've done that is I love being able to be an influence in students' lives. And number one, being a voice that's telling them, like, hey, you can really do this. But also number two, giving them some vision of, like, it can be really meaningful. And it's cool. Like, we're in this generation. I mean, I think it started probably with millennials, but it's intensified as you get younger, that, like, people really want their work to matter. They want it to be meaningful, right? I mean, I'm sure you feel that. Like, like, if I'm going to be doing something, I want it to mean something. And I think some of the tension they feel is it's like, but I look at the corporate world and it just feels like,
I don't want to punch in. I don't want to sit in a cubicle.
Right? And so you got a whole generation of people that are like, I desperately want to be engaged. Like, the problem is not that they don't want to be engaged. The problem is there's just so little that they feel is inspiring enough to engage with. And that tension, I think, leads to a lot of dissatisfaction of, like, I want my life to be making a difference. I want to be making an impact. And I feel like I'm just typing a bunch of, I'm keying a bunch of stuff in on my laptop. And so, probably more than ever, we have entire generations of people that are looking for, like, hey, how do I marry these two things? Like, how do I make my job and my investment of time there, like, meaningful, but also pay the bills,
Right.
And so hopefully, hopefully that's part of what I'm accomplishing.
It's amazing how it happened. It just, life happens and it comes full circle, sure. Right? Because like there's so many things that you take from your time in ministry, from your parents teaching, from that moment where your parents said, we didn't take jobs to make money. Like, like you said, you could have cashed out and be on a beach, but you wouldn't have meaning.
Yeah.
Like you'd be kind of empty back to what you were in college, right? Yeah. And now like you're at the entrepreneur in resident at OU, and like you have the kind of the ministry background for you, but you also give value not from just a life perspective, but an entrepreneur perspective, because like you said, they brought you back because you're successful at business, right? Not necessarily because you have a degree in or whatever it is, which is really neat to look back and look at and see how everything circles back.
Yeah. I think humility, one of our company values is humility. And it's like, well, what's humility? And, I think there's this kind of Bible Belt type of perspective that humility is this kind of like almost like false modesty. Like you tell somebody like, hey, you're really good at podcasting. You're good at asking interview questions. And that humility is being like, oh, no, I'm not really, stop it. I don't think that's humility. I think humility is when you just have a sober-minded view. Like you really have self-awareness, right? And like that drives you being less self-absorbed and thinking about yourself less, because you realize like in the larger scope of what's going on and everything else that like it just, anything we accomplish is a result of a lot of things. And I heard somebody say this once that, like originality is forgetting where you stole it from. But like so much of the way that we talk, of our values, of our thought processes, these are all things that are fragments and conglomerations of, are the people that have influenced us, our parents, our close friendships, influential people that we've looked to over the years. And so for sure, I'm not an exception. Like when I think about where I'm at today, it's, it's a conglomeration of a whole bunch of experiences and people that have poured into me, and also just some good fortune mixed in there. And I think like we've worked hard. Like I've worked hard. I've tried to do the best I can with the gifts I've been given. And yet, none of this goes this way without a lot of other things. Like, you could start with even simple stuff like, hey, I won the lottery when I was born in this country.
Oh, yeah.
I won the lottery when I was born in this country during a period that the internet was going to be invented.
Yeah.
I won the lottery when I got born to my parents, right? I was born healthy. Like, you just start looking at, like, things that, like...
So many variables.
Yeah, and that things that, like, went my way.
Yeah, that we will take for granted.
I have no agency in, right? Yeah. We can all say, like, okay, clearly, like, that there's nothing I did to make those things happen. And so, I think that's been helpful. Like, even as you think about, like, hey, how do you want to use your platform? And there's this idea that I'm kind of fascinated with of, like, text and subtext. And, like, text is, like, what you say. Subtext is what people hear, right? And so I think about that, like when I'm talking about the company or I'm even talking about my own life, what's the text? But then what's the subtext? Is the text like, oh, we've been really fortunate and aw shucks, it's been great, but the subtext is really like, hey, we're pretty great and look at what we built,
right?
And so I think about that a lot, and how I really hope that the subtext that people get anytime they interact with me is that I really do, there really is a sense of humility, because humility doesn't come naturally for me. Like I said, I'm as selfish as anybody, and I'm as, as prideful as anybody, but it's an area that I want to continue to grow in. And when I talk about the success that the company's had, and I talk about even the ways that I've grown, I always want that to be clear.
Yeah. Do you think the company would still be successful if you hadn't gone through that business with your brother first, and the ups and downs of that, and the learnings and the stuff that you've kind of gained from that?
It's a great question, man. The thing about counterfactuals is you'll never know, which is what makes them so interesting. Yeah. You can play the counterfactual game and even come to conclusions that you're just sure are right, but you never know if it even was possible that it could have gone that way. I will say this, and I've said this to him. He had so much of a harder job than I did. It's so much easier to go second. He was thrown into leading a company with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue as like a 20-something. Yeah. And that is a lot of responsibility. And I had the opportunity to kind of more be his number two and kind of watch. And it's easy to kind of point out like, hey, well, this could have been better, or, this or whatever. But the reality is that's an insanely challenging job for anybody. What that experience did for me is I think it prepared me for some of the emotional cycles that you go through when you're starting something, and some of the pitfalls. And you still have to go through them, but when you know they're coming and you know they're normal, I think that, like, when my wife and I first got married, we joined this young marrieds kind of class at our church, and all the other couples were further ahead in marriage than we were. But the most valuable thing about it was that we were able to hear them tell stories about what they were experiencing in their marriage. And then when we went through that, it was like, oh, we're not just like defective. Like, this is a thing that like normal people experience, right? And so I think that helped me a lot. And it also helped me to have a really clear vision for, like, hey, what is, kind of the culture that we want to create. But, my favorite quote, maybe of all time, is the Roosevelt quote about the man who's in the arena, where he really functionally says, like, it is so easy to sit in the cheap seats and just point at the guy on the field and say, how did you miss that? Or, oh, like, that's a stupid play call, or what are you doing? But that the credit really belongs to people who are willing to get out there and try. Entrepreneurship is hard. Trying to do anything where you put yourself out there is hard. And you're going to get bloodied up, and there are going to be things that don't go well, and it's going to be imperfect. But the simple fact that you're willing to get out there and you're willing to try, that's so much of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, totally agree with you. Like, listening to you say that, it makes so much sense that, like, just kind of watching, like, just being one step back and seeing, your brother go through that stuff, right? And see these, you gave a perfect example of being in marriage class. Like, you're like, oh, this is normal. You guys already been through this. Like, it makes so much sense, and it's such a great kind of way to explain it. So, I mean, a lot of people can go to the website and see the story and research and figure out how it all happened. So I don't want you to dive too much into that. But obviously you're working in a business, and then, like, who says to you, like, hey, I have an idea that we should now sell cups, right? Like,
how did this all come to?
Right, yeah.
Well, it's so funny. Like, the way that the business started, there were two guys that I had worked with for several years. I'd known both of them for more than a decade, and they worked underneath me in this organization with my brother. And they just kind of approached me one day. We went out to lunch. They just said, hey, would you be willing to just do a side project with us? We love working with you, and it'd be fun, and we could sell things online. And that was really, like, it was not this kind of visions, grandiose visions. It was just kind of like, hey, it'd be fun to do a side project. And all we knew was, hey, we want to do something in e-commerce because we have really deep expertise there. We want to make really good product. And we want to start by selling on Amazon. That was it. That was the extent. Oh, and I think the other thing is we really had a sense of, like, culturally what we would want it to be about, as big or small as it ended up being. And we started out by making a list of, like, all these products that we could sell. And I've pulled that list up in in recent months, and it's just, there's a bunch of just terrible ideas on there. Like ideas where it's like compost bins. Like, if we had picked compost bins as, like, our product of choice, we were probably not doing this podcast. But we had a couple of good ideas on there, and we were fortunate enough as we went out and started getting samples on some of our ideas to find a really outstanding manufacturing partner internationally that made our product type. And this is right when, Yeti is really kind of coming onto the scene with their stainless steel tumblers, and Hydro Flask is really starting to grow. And so, like, the timing was really good. What we found is the timing was kind of right. It was just a fantastic product. Like, the first time you have something with vacuum insulation, it feels kind of like magic. It's like, okay, how in the world does this work? How is it the ice not melting? And but all of our competitors were really focused on physical retail. There wasn't really a big brand that had really seriously focused on Amazon. And so we thought, hey, this is an opportunity. It started with us buying, I think, literally like 500 bottles and listing them on Amazon. And, early on, we had just enough success that it was like, okay, I think we're onto something. And it basically started this process of, we'd get inventory in, we would sell through it. We'd have to place a reorder, and every reorder I would feel like you kind of go through this emotional roller coaster. Like, we'd get the inventory in, and I'd say, man, this is selling fast. We need to buy more. okay, let's be aggressive. We weren't aggressive enough last time. Let's be aggressive. Okay, we're going to buy this much. Place a purchase order that night. I wake up, I've made a huge mistake. Like I'm going to bankrupt myself, and then the inventory gets in and it's like, oh man, we didn't buy enough. And then you just rinse and repeat. And imagine doing that for, several years. But that was how we kind of got off the ground. One of the really atypical things about how we started the company, the first 10 people I hired, there was only one that I hadn't known for at least a decade. Mm-hmm. And part of the thought process there was, it's one thing to say, hey, these are our values and this is what we want to be about. A lot of people will hear the things that we lay out as like what we want the company to be about, and we'll say, well, that sounds great. Yeah. Like who wouldn't want to, work that?
Right.
But it's one thing to say like, hey, in a vacuum, that sounds great. It's another thing to have actually lived it out. And so, especially early on, had this incredibly high bar of, I want to hire people where I've actually know them and have seen this demonstrated in their life. And that was kind of the first year of the company getting up and off the ground. And then, over time, we start to really develop a following on Amazon. We go to, Target and say, hey, listen, your customer, they're buying us. They're just not buying us in Target. They're buying us on Amazon. And this was during a period where all the retailers were just terrified of Amazon. Maybe they still are. I don't know. Amazon's, it's quite a business. But Target thought it was compelling, and we got into Target, and then things. It's like the snowball analogy. It just really started to pick up steam, and 6 years later, this is where we are.
So it was Simple Modern from the get-go. Then it wasn't like you weren't just like buying and reselling in bulk, like people look at Amazon resellers or whatever.
But even like people ask me, they'll be like, "Man, that's a great name. How'd you come up with that?" And the story is kind of lame. It was like. We titled the entity is titled Real Value, which is just like so generic. And we were going to register on Amazon with that, and we couldn't. It was taken. And so we had to like scramble and come up with something. And we came up with Simple Modern. And now, ironically, 6 years later, it's like, man, that's a great brand name. It's like these two words with incredibly positive connotations in the world that we live in.
Could have been a lot worse.
It could have been a lot worse. That's right.
Yeah, 6 years of it though. It's a short amount of. In a business world, that's not a long amount of time, right?
No, and it's like I wrote a blog post about this maybe a year ago. Like, I think of us as a startup, but I was in this office talking with one of our team members, and I just kind of offhand said something about as a startup, and he just looked at me. He's like, "Look around, we are not a startup." And it's like, I don't know when you exit being like a quote unquote startup. To some extent, maybe it's just a mentality of not being content. And that we're going to push the frontier. We are going to try and do more and to grow. And so maybe you don't ever grow out of being a startup. Bezos will talk about this with Amazon, about trying to kind of instill this day one mentality of like, hey, it's always day one. And the moment that it's day two, we start to die. And so I don't know how that works, but I have this kind of organizational theory that the way you think about an organization is whatever that organization was like when you came into it. You forever anchor to that, kind of like the imprinting idea. You forever anchor to that. And that will always be internally your understanding of what the true organization really is. No matter how much it changes, how many people come and go, like in your mind, that's the true organization. And so for me, the true Simple Modern is the scrappy, like nobody's given us a chance. We're in a market where we, we're surrounded by these massive competitors that have way more money and way more brand recognition. And I don't know, hopefully I never grow out of that.
Yeah, because just like you just said, like if you do grow out of it, that's when you're in trouble. Like when you think, oh, we've made it, no big deal. Like,
exactly.
I think there's some entrepreneur guys that I listen to, and they're like they're 7-figure business, but like his thing is like, we're going after Nike, like we're not done. Like, and when you think of someone that's doing 7-8 figures or whatever, like that's a ridiculous amount of money, and like I'd have a warehouse full of cars and I'd be playing golf all year. But back to meaning and just life in general, like, you know, it's not about the money sometimes. It's about life impact and meaning, and it's not about just you and the corporate guys. It's about the other employees that you have, you know, and the goal, like I said, when you hired people, you know, you hired people who you really knew. Yeah. You know?
It's interesting. So in 2020, one of the things that started to really pick up with COVID, there's just all this money, you know, the money supply just kind of blows out, and valuations for companies like ours blow out. And I think it was that year that I had to start like an acquisitions folder in my email, because I was getting just about every day somebody saying, hey, we'd love to buy your company. And I really thought before that started to happen, like, I wouldn't have any interest in selling the company. But the more that I've been kind of solicited, the more it's really solidified and entrenched that belief. And, you know, people will ask me about it, and it's like, think about it this way. I get to go to work every day. I've got relationships with the people I work with. Like, these are like not just people I work with, but these are like friendships, and these are relationships that matter to me. Their families matter to me. I get to work on interesting things. I get to be creative. I get to create things. I get to make other people's lives better with things. Like, I have this person that I co-taught with in one of my classes at OU. Her father got cancer and was dying of cancer, and she sends me this text. She had bought one of our water bottles, and she's like, hey, it's a small thing, but my dad used this water bottle the last 10 days of his life. It was the only way he could drink, you know, and it made his life a little bit easier, and I just want to say thank you. So, like, I get to do that every day, and I have a really clear sense of kind of mission here. Why in the world would I trade that for a stack of paper? You know, I think that, like, the whole idea with money, here's what everybody's after. Everybody's after quality of life, right? And I think that the thought process is, I understand that money doesn't inherently lead to quality of life, but I feel like if I had enough of it, I could figure it out. I think this is what most people think. And the reality is, the correlation and the tie between money and quality of life is so much weaker and looser than we assume intuitively. And I already am, like, insanely rich in the things that matter. And so why would I ever try and trade that? You know, like, another way that I've said it to some people is, the best part of having a successful business is that every day when I wake up, I've got something meaningful I can go and work on. That's the reward. That's the payday, right? That when I'm 55, 65, I might have something that I can pour my time into instead of going and sitting on a golf course. Like, how banal is that, right? Like, and that's the reward. And so for me, like, that's been the quality of life compensation, is that I feel like I'm surrounded by relationships and a purpose and you know, an opportunity to contribute that for sure enriches my life a lot better than, you know, the resources ever will.
That's one thing that, I mean, people ask me about the podcast and you know, and that podcast and golf. I mean, the golf you can play until you die, and something that I'm glad that I, you know, started playing it from such a young age, and it's given me every opportunity that I can think of, really, as everything I have can tie back to a relationship I met in golf. But the podcast as well, like, one of my kind of podcast idols is Larry King. I mean, he died last year, but he podcasted or interviewed till he died. You know, like, that's a great thing to have. And, you know, as long as I've got the ability to converse and speak as long as I can, then I think that's something that I would always do, because it's just so much fun, right?
Absolutely.
You know, it would be nice to have some paper for it a bit more, but at the same time, like, you know, I would probably still do it. You know, like, it's just so much fun. You know, and, like, it gives you meaning. It gives you something to get up and go to work for today. And then, you know, whether it's, you know, honing your interview technique or picking a new design, you know, or just whatever it is, like, it's something that, you know, as much as we would like to spend 2 or 3 weeks or a month on the beach in Maui, like, if you're there for probably 8 weeks, you probably start to scratch your head. You're like, it's time to get back to work.
You know what makes vacation great is that it's not normative. The moment that, like, going to Maui was normative, like, it would lose. In fact, like, when they were filming Lost, I remember, like, there were these people that just, you know, the crew had to live there, and they were just like, I'm ready for seasons again. I'm ready for it to get cold. Like, you know, when it's every day.
Perfect.
There's this great, the guy who wrote Good to Great, Jim Collins, he shares a story about kind of one of his mentors. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he wrote The 1 Minute Manager and a bunch of other really famous management books. And they developed kind of a friendship and a mentorship. And he went to visit him. He might have been in England, actually, where he was living. But he goes to visit him, and the guy takes him into his study and shows him like this shelf full of books that he's published, right? So there's like 30 books on the shelf. And he says to Collins, he says, you know what I'm most proud of? He says, here's what I published up to 65, and there's like 5 books. And he's like, and here's what I published since 65, and it's like the other 25 books. Yeah. And it's just that same idea that like, in some ways, the older we get, the more we have to contribute. When we're young, it's easy to be like, I want to contribute. I want people to take me seriously. I want to make a name for myself. And yet the amount that we should be listened to is probably less. Yeah. Right. But as we get older, like our ability to contribute and to mentor and to kind of, serve in that kind of sage role goes up. And so, yeah, I'm with you, man. I don't think... My hope is that I feel like I'm able to contribute in deeper ways at 65 than I am at 42. Yeah. I'll be disappointed if that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, something's off if you get to that stage, right?
Yeah, there's a reason why like Chinese culture and, other cultures, like there's reverence for people, for older people, like it makes sense. Like there's a wisdom and a depth of knowledge there that we all benefit from. And so anyway, yeah, hopefully that's, aging well is one of the hardest things in life, I've kind of determined. And so one of the things that I'll say all the time when I'm talking to students about businesses is that I don't really have too much admiration for anybody who hasn't been through a full business cycle. Mm-hmm. There will always be somebody that's kind of like the flavor of the week, like, oh, this startup, it's growing like crazy, and this guy's 27, and it's like, that's fine. But I really admire the people where it's like they've been through the big ups and big downs, because number one, the empathy with other people that have started things that haven't gone well or failed or have been hard, is there. But there's just a higher self-awareness and a deeper understanding of how fortunate they are. And so I do think there's something similar about life, that it's like, for us to continue to grow into the people that we want to become, you have to go through some of those cycles. Right. You have to have the devastating L at one point in your life, and pick up the pieces. You have to have the thing that you dreamed would go one way and it just didn't happen that way, and how you responded to it. And I think that's kind of my theory of why aging is so hard, is because it's so easy to become cynical, over time. And hopefully I don't go that way. It's a personal goal.
The one thing I kind of talk about to friends and like, because back home isn't really a very big entrepreneurial culture. The UK, I didn't grow up in an entrepreneurial culture. I think one person out of like 25 of my core friends back home, my kind of golfing group, owns their own business, So, but one of the things I keep telling people is that, I came here with my golf clubs in a suitcase. I could always go back to zero, right? Like if I built from there on up, like you could always go back to that apartment in Norman,
Absolutely.
And like how that feels, and that you got here from that. And there's so much power in that, because you're not holding on when you're taking risks.
For sure,
they're not massive. When you think of it that way, they're not.
Absolutely,
and that's
there's this
power.
great, like you don't even have to be spiritual to appreciate this. There's this great thing in the Bible. It's like you come in with nothing, you leave with nothing, guaranteed. Everybody, 100%. Yeah. You come in with nothing, you leave with nothing. So the risk that you really have is pretty low. Right. You're like, I'm not going to have any of this money. I'm not going to have any of these physical things. They're just kind of in my like legal name for this kind of section of time, and then they're not going to be anymore. And so it's really helped me to kind of have this perspective of like, you know what? It's a lot easier to be generous and open-handed when it's like, I can't hang on to it anyway. Right. Yeah. And like you said, the more that Tim Ferriss has this great thing that he would teach a class at Yale, but one of the things he would tell students is like, visualize the worst possible thing that could happen in your life. And then I want you to work through what would you do if that thing happened. And like the reality is, the more that you actually start to think about, okay, what is the worst case scenario? Okay, it happens tomorrow. What would you do? The more you realize you'd adapt, you know, and you'd be okay. Like you'd be able to work through it. And so like I agree, it's helpful. Because we can kind of mentally get into these mindsets of like, oh, if I ever, you know, if this ever happened or if that ever happened, and what that does is it makes us more kind of close-handed with things, and it also kind of inspires us to operate out of fear.
Yeah,
right,
definitely.
Yeah.
And the things that like, you know, back to you could go back to what your parents said. Like we didn't get this job because we wanted to make a ton of money. It's impact, it's legacy, it's, you know, people remembering you whenever you're gone. I mean, the one thing about life is we don't know if, like, I could get in a car crash on the way home and I could not make it home. Like, we don't know, right? So it's just like, you know, and leaving that legacy, and that's super powerful. And there's people that really don't care, and then there's others that, like, that's all they strive for. You know, like they might want a statue of themselves outside of OU. Who knows? But finishing up, because I don't want to take too much of your time, and we're getting up to about an hour. Obviously there's a ton of products, you know, like you're evolving and creativity side, and you know, got a great team here. You mentioned the Clay Thompson thing earlier, which is kind of organic, but are there any kind of, not standout moments, but just moments along the journey in such a short time of 6 years of this business? Is there anything that's just like, not like a wow moment, because I'm sure there's a lot, but just moments that, you know, just that it might not have been a wow moment generally for the company, but for you it was like, okay, I'm you know, just happy. You know, does that make sense?
I'll give you, there's definitely have been ones like, you know, the first time you see your product on shelves, you know, you get kind of that like feeling in your stomach of just like, wow. You know, it's kind of like the first time I heard one of my children, you know, my son Carter's heartbeat on the ultrasound. Like you have this kind of emotional response that you don't expect. And there have definitely been some moments like that where it's just like, oh wow, like, man, that's amazing. And I, you know, like I've been so engrossed in getting to this point that now I can kind of sit back and say like, this is incredible, and there's a lot of gratitude. Honestly, I think the things that have made me the most proud are things that people don't see. You know, it's really, so I have this question that I ask every employee when they've been here about 90 days. I'll just say, hey, how did your expectation compare to your actual experience? Like, how is the reality compared to your expectation? And the reason that matters so much to me is like, I really do think that we have kind of a special culture. But I'd say that if there's anything like a fear or a danger that I want to avoid, it's ever that the external perception would be better or different than the internal reality. And I've just been so pleased and proud that, and I think they're being honest with me. Who knows? I think they're being honest with me. I consistently have people tell me, like, actually, like, what it's been like to be a part of the company has been better than what I would have even expected from the outside. And I just think when I see people that are a part of our team grow and thrive, that's easly, to me, like the most exciting part. It's not flashy, you know, like the Wall Street Journal's not writing an article about that. But I think I think the reason why that stuff makes me the most proud is that there's a lot of companies that grow really fast or that produce a lot of sales, and just behind the scenes there's like carnage, right? You know, and there's burnout, and you know, it's kind of an at what cost. And for what I would hope is that what's going on externally with the way the brand's growing and the way that people respond to the company would simply be an outflow of the fact that internally it's healthy, and that what we're about and the things we're focusing on, that's resonating with people. And so, so my proudest moments, and I'll take it even a step further, you know, with all the people that I manage, everybody has their things, right? Their weaknesses and areas they're working on. And man, I get so proud and so encouraged when I see somebody who I know has been struggling in an area and they see a breakthrough, you know, whether it's through, you know, me or somebody else encouraging them and them having a growth mindset. And so, ultimately that stuff means the most, you know, because these are the relationships I'm surrounded by and the people that matter the most. So certainly there's been plenty of that external stuff that it's kind of like, is this real? But at the end of the day, because relationships are so central to like what really matters, that's the stuff that sticks with me.
Yeah. That's really cool to hear. That's not what I expected, so it's awesome. Last question. You mentioned a lot of really cool authors. I get the sense that you're a continual learner. You're always reading something, diving into management books. How can we improve? What are you reading at the moment?
So I've gotten on a real biography kick.
Okay.
You know, like I think it's just fascinating to be able to look at other people's lives in their entirety and learn from it. And so, you know, at this point, I don't know, I probably go through 12 or 15 a year at least. It's hard because, like, I listen to them when I'm in my car, but, like, I don't really have much of a commute anymore. And so between raising kids and running the company, but that's been really fantastic. And part of the reason, I think, is it just makes me more reflective.
Right.
You know, like, I recently read a book called Titan, which is Chernow's biography of Rockefeller. And, you know, it was interesting because I went in thinking it'll be really interesting to learn about him as a businessman and all that stuff. All that stuff actually is not what I took from it. It was the way that he thought about his giving, and it was his relationship with his son were these kind of central themes that actually stuck with me. And it made me think about it, you know, like, okay, how am I going to approach giving, and what is my relationship with my son, and how do I set an example for my son where he's challenged and where, you know, at the same time I don't create standards that are unhealthy or unhelpful for him. You know, like Rockefeller's son spent his entire life kind of feeling that he could just never quite measure up to who his dad was. It was kind of this weight. And so with each of the biographies, like, there's just a different aspect. Like I'm doing Disney right now, which is another great one, but it's really helpful, not just because of what you learn, but also because the way that it helps me to be reflective. And then there's a lot of other great stuff. Like I read a book called The Body, which is a guide for occupants, which is incredible. It's like if you there's just like so much stuff about our body that is just fascinating. And, you know, so like I'll kind of jump around, but generally I try and stick with biographies. If you want, I can send you a list of like 20 or 30 of the last ones I've read, and you can put it in the show notes. Yeah,
we can definitely do that. Well, Mike, thanks so much, man. This has been awesome. I think, you know, I really appreciate you sharing. This interview went in a direction I didn't expect it to, and I'm glad it went the way it did. Because a lot of the time we come here, we talk about the story and everything, and it's kind of very formal, but this was really neat to hear you really dive deep into, you know, kind of the story and the meaning, and, you know, the 90-day rule, the people working here, you're asking questions, and just kind of, there's so much value in there that there's people listening going to get a lot of value from it. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for the thoughtful questions. I mean, it's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, man. For people listening, I will post the link to the website and social media. You're probably already following. You know exactly what we're talking about. But if you have any ideas, I'm sure you can send them in, or we'll find an email for you to send them in. Questions, comments, ways to reach out to Mike. And thanks for listening. We'll catch you next episode. Cheers. This podcast is presented by the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, telling Oklahoma story through its people since 1927. For more information on the Hall of Fame, go to www.oklahomahof.com and follow them on Instagram for daily updates at oklahomahof.
Thank you for listening. We are inspired by those around us and hope that you are too. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review so we can keep telling your stories. For more great Oklahoma content, follow This Is Oklahoma on Facebook and Instagram.